Hello everyone and welcome to this lecture 6 on which we're going to focus on energy resources, looking at how hungry we are as a society in terms of energy, what type of energy we're using. Then we'll be looking at the topic of non-renewable resources and in particular fossil fuel energy. For that part, I'm inviting you first to complete your lecture prep for this lecture since the majority of those fossil fuel will be presented in those lecture prep, and I will kind of skip this part. Then we'll talk about nuclear energy and how it's an interesting energy resource to talk about and to not neglect. Finally, we will be talking about renewable energy resources, alternative energy resources, alternative solutions that allow us to save some energy or at least to be more sustainable in terms of our use of energy resources. So this lecture will be divided into 3 chapters. I expect, however, to make 4 videos about that lecture. 1 video about energy sources, 1 video about non-renewable energy resources, and then possibly 2 videos on renewable energy and alternative ideas. Okay, so let's start with the first part on energy sources and looking at how the different type of energy sources that we have in our society, and this is only a summary. We have still other source of resources, but the most principal one are listed below. So we have, in fact, from that main source of energy, we have 2 categories: what we can describe as non-renewable energy resources and renewable energy resources. So within the non-renewable energy resources, we do have the fossil fuel energy resources, which are made up of coal, mostly petroleum or oil and natural gas. Then inside of the non-renewable resources, we also have nuclear energy resource, which is mostly using uranium, which is a mineral that is found in the soil of some countries in particular, and it's kind of limited. And then we do have also biomass, such as wood, for example, such as feedstock, crops that can be used to power and produce some energy. This is also limited because it's limited by the amount of biomass that we have available. Then on the renewable side, we do have, in fact, the biomass. By some, biomass is considered renewable, others consider it non-renewable. It's considered renewable if you think that biomass is always reproducing itself. And so ideally, your crops will be produced over time and you can make it, or the wood, the tree, you can use it as a combustible. However, this takes time. And if you do that all the time, you might deplete your soil. And so the renewability of that part is kind of a bit tricky. Besides that, we do have what I would call true renewable energy resources, mostly solar energy that will be using the sun to power up and to make our electricity in general, that's to produce electricity. In fact, I should mention renewable energy usually tend to produce only electricity. Non-renewable energy tend to produce mostly electricity, but other type of source of energy. Then we have the wind that is based on the motion of the air. We do have what we call hydropower, mostly dams or waves also that's making moving all the flowing water that will be using this energy from the flowing water to turn it into electricity. And then what we call geothermal, which is the energy from the planet, from the Earth. And so we're using that inside crust energy to produce also some energy. If we look at how we've been using our energy in our society, we have been very hungry and it doesn't go down. In fact, energy consumption is on the constant increase in the world over time. We can see it's almost following also the same pattern as population, but with our increase in technology, our increase of consumption of technology, we tend to have increased the consumption of energy. As I mentioned, this is caused by the increase of population, the fact that our countries are getting more developed economically, so we have access to all that technology, and we can consume easily that energy, which is available to us. And if we're looking at where this energy is coming from, about 84% of all the energy that we use, including electricity, but not only electricity, comes from fossil fuel sources. 84%. That's why it's so difficult to get out of fossil fuel energy resources, because it's the majority of our energy source. It's expected that within the next 50 years, in the next 30 years, by 2050, the increase of energy will be by about 50%, mostly from the countries that are right now developing, what we call the non-OECD countries. Just OECD for the country that are OECD are the country that are economically developed. The non-OECD are the developing countries. And what we can see is there is a true increase from those developing countries. And while they will be using more renewable energy resources, I mean, the main increase will still happen with fossil fuel and non-renewable one. How do we consume energy? If we're looking at, in particular, for the US, we found out that we have three major resources of energy, which in fact tend to be the fossil fuel energy. We have petroleum for 36%, natural gas 29%, and coal for 16%. Then we have renewable energy 10% and nuclear for 9%. So in general, those are kind of very in minority, and the fossil fuel energy takes, again, this 80-something%. How do we use petroleum versus coal versus natural gas? Each of them, as you can see, has a different function. This color gives you, in fact, the indication of how we're using it. If we're looking at petroleum, 72% of petroleum is used for transportation, mostly transportation and industry. We don't use, in fact, it's not efficient at all to use petroleum for electric power. In fact, it's more that it is very expensive to do that. Instead, for electric power, coal in the US is the major one, and a little bit in the industry. Interestingly, natural gas, so let me show, is that natural gas has kind of a multitask function, because it's about a third to be used as to produce electricity, a third for the industry, and a third for residential and commercial, where we're using it, for example, for the gas stove or heating or stuff like that, warming up the water tanks. And little is used by transportation. There was a push to use it for transportation some years ago, but it didn't take. It was kind of too dangerous. But mostly we see, if you're looking at the energy we use for transportation, it's mostly petroleum, oil. The energy we use for electricity in the US will be coal and natural gas. The energy we use in industry, mostly petroleum and natural gas. If we're looking at residential, it's mostly natural gas in itself. So there is some kind of very specific target of consumption depending on the source of energy we're using. If we look overall the world and see who's consuming the most, well, we could be happy. I mean, because the US tend to be usually the one, targeted to be a big consumer. But over the last 10 years, China has taken over. China are the first one consuming energy, then followed by the US, then followed by Europe. Altogether, they take about a bit more than 50% of all the energy used in the world, 53%. However, if you divide those numbers by the numbers of the population, then the US goes by far to be the first one. It's a big thing because, remember, the US is about 300 million people, China is more than 1.4 billion people, and Europe is over the 300-400 million people. I can't remember exactly the number, but if we do divide again this number by the amount of people, that's what we found. And the US is consuming twice more than what's being in Europe, or 3 times more than what's consumed in China. So the US is the most energy-poor country per capita. If we're looking at the electricity, which is the main energy type of source that we're using at this point, most of the electricity nowadays, globally or in the US, is still made mostly from fossil fuel. How do we do that? And we can see it between the world and the US, 2013. We have coal plus natural gas plus oil right here, making about 2/3 of the electricity of production. Then we're using also nuclear power plants, and then after the renewable energy. How do we produce electricity? Whatever the source of energy the source we're using, we're always making it the same way. We use the resource to make a combustion, which will in fact heat a fluid. Usually this fluid will be some water. As we can see, we use coal to heat some water that goes into some pipes. The same with nuclear energy, we're using the nuclear reaction to warm up a liquid that goes into a pipe. This liquid will transform into gas, into the gas phase. This gas phase will make turning a turbine right here, as you can see. Once the gas goes over the turbine, it will be condensing again to liquid and going back to the combustion center, combustion chamber. And then the turbine that has been moved by the flow of the water vapor that is being moved into by the steam is in fact turning, and this rotation is in fact powering up a generator, and this electric generator will be in fact producing electricity from the motion of the turbine. So it's always the same way. We're burning a fossil fuel, we're burning an energy resource, we're heating up some water to make some steam. The steam will turn a generator that will produce electricity, or I should say turn a turbine that is linked to a generator and that's producing electricity. So with that, I mean, we will see now we have kind of an understanding on how we are consuming electricity, the different sources of electricity, and how we're producing electricity from those sources of energy. With the next video, we'll be looking at particularly the fossil fuel energy resources, the non-renewable energy resources. And so I invite you to join me as soon as you're ready. See you in a bit.